Okay. All right. So, vegetable gardening, there's a lot to talk about. Um, and if you do have questions, and we won't really have time, it'll be hard to manage questions, you can always email us at contact, and we'll try to answer your questions later. Or you can always call the office, and we'll try to answer your questions as we can too. So, um, I like to talk about four different phases for parts of vegetable gardening. You know, um, And so it's preparing the garden, planting the garden, caring for the garden, and of course, harvesting and storing produce. And as with many things in life, preparing the garden is probably one of the biggest parts of it. So we'll probably spend a fair amount of time on that. And some of this refers to site selection, meaning like where are you going to put your gardens? For some of you who maybe have already got that figured out, you may not need to pay as much attention, although if you're planning future gardens, it's just good to be thinking about these things because it makes a big, big difference on where you're going to put your garden. The perfect site does not exist. So I tell people to try and pick the best site available. Um, find a site that has the best combination of these three things. That would be sunshine, good soil, and good drainage. And we'll talk about each of those a little bit in detail. Um, you know, Full sun versus shade. I often get the question about which vegetables grow best in the shade because many people have shade in their backyard and they don't have very much sunshine. And the answer, unfortunately, is none. Really, all vegetables do best with full sun. There might be some exceptions if you were actually trying to grow something like lettuce, which is a cool season crop, and you're trying to grow it in the summer. You would probably try and do some shade. But generally you're looking for 8 hours of strong sun, and lots of times a gardening book might mention, say, oh, look for 4 to 6 hours at least of sun. That's like the minimum, but that's not really good enough. So you're looking for 8 hours, and it should be the middle part of the day rather than like the end of the day. So like 12 to 8 p.m., you might still have sunshine in the summer, but the last part of that day is not very good sun. So really think more like in terms of like 9 to 5, full sunshine is the best. Especially if you're trying to grow vegetables that produce fruits. And that would be things like tomatoes and peppers and squash, cucumbers, melons, all those things that produce fruits definitely need full sun to get their best production. Leafy crops are a little more tolerant, definitely more tolerant than fruiting crops if you are going to have too much shade and not enough sun. The thing is, plants that are in full sun, they'll be sturdier, they'll be healthier, and they will do much better and produce more food. So, how to get the best sun for your site? Sometimes you might actually need to trim some branches, remove trees. I don't like to remove trees, but if you've got too many trees and you need them to come down anyhow, sure, you might remove some trees. Also, don't plant too close to buildings, especially like your house. If it's a 2-story house, you don't want to be having the house shading your garden. Generally, the south side of the house is okay because that's generally always at the sunshine. So I tell people, look at your site at different times of the day to make sure it's going to be in sunshine at all the different times of the day. Um, this time of year, the sun is more to the south, and so it will kind of fool you. Think about what it's going to be like also overhead, from morning till night, and that'll give you a better picture of what the sunshine will look like throughout the season. As far as preparing your garden, that site, picking the site. As far as soil goes, I also advise people to look for the best soil on the site. And this sounds kind of crazy because you think, wouldn't it all be the same? But actually, there's a lot of variation in soil on any given site. So what you're going to do is look for the best soil on your site in your yard. Um, and so basically, you're looking for loose texture, dark color, soil that crumbles easily. Those are all good indicators. So I tell people to actually go out with a shovel and dig with a shovel in several areas, turn over a spade, and see what you get. You're trying to avoid the areas that have clay soil. Clay is just very difficult to grow in. It's kind of interesting. Older houses will have better soil typically because the newer construction, lots of times what they do, the first thing they do is they take a bulldozer and they'll scrape away all the good topsoil. And it's very frustrating for the new homeowner trying to get a garden going. But that said, generally for any site, usually the farther away from the house, usually the better the soil will be. But that's because when they're, building a house, they have to dig out the basement. They have lots of heavy equipment. It's compacted, and lots of times they put clay back in there. But if you're far away from the house, you'll usually have better soil. The other thing you're looking for when trying to pick that site is you're looking for good drainage. And all drainage means is the ability of the soil to carry away excess water. So you should have, you want a site that's going to be level as possible. It's difficult to garden on hillsides unless you have terraces or use raised beds. But what you're really trying to do is avoid low places where water will collect, where it will pool. Like look at the picture here. This is in somebody's backyard, and after a rain, you can see the rain just collects there and stands there for a long time. That is definitely not good. So I tell people again to avoid clay soils because they drain slowly and the soil stays wet too long. So you're trying to avoid that bad drainage. One way that you can improve drainage, if you do have bad drainage, is to use raised beds. And we'll talk a little bit about raised beds and show you how that can help you. All right, so we're still thinking about preparing the garden, but another part of that preparation is planning. And if you read any garden book, it's going to tell you at the very beginning, make a garden plan. And I'm going to tell you the same thing. And different parts of your plan, there's going to be different decisions you're going to make as you garden. So part of it is you're going to be, are you deciding to have raised beds, or are you going to have ground plots? Are you going to have organic gardening, or are you going to be a non-organic gardening, a chemical gardening? You're going to have to choose which crops you're going to grow. And then, of course, you're actually going to have to lay these out and plan where they're going to go in your garden plot. And then beyond that crop selection, you're going to actually pick varieties, just like tomatoes will be one of your crops that you might pick, but there's a million different kinds of tomatoes to pick. So what varieties are you going to pick? These are all going to be part of your plan. All right, so looking at those decisions that I just mentioned, raised beds versus ground plots. There's a big gardening movement right now, people wanting to do raised beds, and there's lots of good reasons for that. So one of the advantages is that the soil warms up faster, but also, as we just mentioned a minute ago, you'll have better soil drainage. You can actually grow more food per square foot in less space using raised beds because you're not having a lot of space that's devoted to garden paths in between. So it will actually increase your production. Disadvantages are they can be expensive if you're buying lumber or paving stones or something like that. And also you need to get some soil to fill them up. And sometimes it's not so easy to get soil. I recommend purchasing soil from a really good company. There's some that we can recommend to you. What we like to recommend is a mixture of half compost and half topsoil. We do that with all our community partner gardens, all our school gardens, and it makes a big, big difference to have that really good soil mix in there. There's different types of raised beds, as I just mentioned. Some of them are made with wood, like the ones we just saw. Some people will pour concrete. Some people use concrete blocks. Some people use bricks or paving stones. But you can also just not use anything on the sides and just have dirt mounded up, like in this picture here. The thing is, the sides, you can't just have them straight up and down like you would with the boards. So they have to slope a little bit, and that takes up more space. And also that sometimes these sides will wash away if you get lots and lots of rain. So mulch can be helpful with that. But in order to make a raised bed like this, you till up your garden, get it nice and loose, and then you kind of use a shovel and you'll dig out the path and put the shovel dirt from this path area and put it up on top of the bed along here. So you're making a long mound, and then you're going to flatten off the top and maybe even make the top a little bit concave shape so that it will catch water rather than just have all the water shed off. You will have to maintain these sides, and again, one thing that will help you do that will be to put mulch on it. We'll talk about mulching later like some straw mulch on the side will stop the water from just washing away the sides really easily. So, all right. So ground plots are the other alternative to, or they are the alternative to raised beds, and that's just where you garden directly in the ground. You're not building a raised bed. And of course, there's some advantages to ground plots. One is that you can grow really, really large amounts of crops in a really big area. It's less labor intensive because you're not building those raised beds, and you don't have those expensive construction costs, the materials, the labor. But one of the keys to maintaining good ground plots is to make the rows wide enough. See this row of plants here and a row of plants here. There's a path in between. Make those paths wide enough so that you can get down them easily, but also so that you can get a rototiller down. Because that's one of the ways that you can keep control of the weeds is to have a rototiller that can go down in between. The alternative to the rototiller would, of course, be to use mulch in between. Even still, you want wide enough paths to make it easy to walk. The disadvantages on the ground plots are that the soil does warm up slower and it's less well drained. You know, it will stay wet longer. And so that can be a disadvantage after a rain. If you want to go out and plant in your garden and it's a ground plot, sometimes it takes a long time to dry out enough to maybe till it and get it ready for planting. But the raised beds, you can typically go out after a rain, like maybe even the day after, and it's dry enough that you can actually start planting and dig up the dirt, whatever you need to do. You do get more soil compaction because as you have these paths in between your rows, you're going to be walking on those. And as you do that, you're going to be packing down the ground. And that can affect the root growth and make it more difficult to get good production. Excuse me. So it just takes more space to have those paths in between the rows. Still, a third alternative, or a third choice, sorry, would be to, as opposed to raised beds or ground plots, is to do container gardening. And there is a big resurgence in interest in container gardening just because lots of people maybe have really small space. Maybe they just have a patio or even a balcony. You can do some containers. But I typically tell people that container gardening is kind of a last resort because you can't get as much production from a few containers as you would from a larger raised bed or a ground plot. So the disadvantages containers, again, you have construction costs if you're building them, or if you're buying them, they're expensive to buy. There are some things that are cheaper than others. Some people will use, like, these are actually plastic drums, 55-gallon drums that did not have anything toxic in them. You can cut them in half and drill holes in them. I've seen people use storage tubs, you know, like you buy at the store for storing things in. You can drill holes in the bottom of those. Whatever container you use, you need to make sure you have holes in it so it will drain. Containers tend to dry out quickly, and they do produce limited amounts of food. But advantages would be if you have really bad soil, you can fill this with really good soil mix, maybe something like that 50-50 compost and topsoil I talked about for raised beds. Some people will even use like a potting type soil. They're also semi-portable, meaning you can move them around, although once they get filled with soil, they're pretty heavy. You might have to put them on a dolly cart to move them around. But it also gives you a taller working height, greater accessibility, which is great if you're having physical limitations like bending over is hard, or for people in wheelchairs. A tall container garden can be really, really helpful. We do a whole separate class on container gardening workshop, and you can check our schedule. If it's not scheduled, we will schedule one at some point. But that's really helpful if you are trying to do container gardening because there's very many things that is useful to know. All right, we're still preparing. We're talking about the decisions you're making for your garden. If you're going to be an organic gardener or a non-organic gardener, sometimes a gardener who uses chemicals. So I do recommend that people use safe insect control methods, and a lot of the non-organic chemical controls are, in my mind, not very safe to use. So I tell people to avoid them. Avoid chemical insecticides that aren't organic. Same with herbicides. So use what we call botanical insecticides or natural insecticides or other non-toxic sprays. And in our insect class, which is coming up later in the season, we will talk about those in detail. We also have some for sale here at our office. They're getting more easy to find. It used to be hard to find these kinds of materials. This is an example of one. This material here is called pyrethrin. It is an organic insecticide that's made from a flower, and it actually is great because it's fairly effective, but also it does not persist in the environment. And that's one of the big advantages to using organic pesticides. So when you're doing any kind of pest control, we do recommend just avoid unnecessary spraying. Sometimes people think every time they see a bug, it's going to be a big problem and they need to, go out and spray. It may be that whatever insect you're seeing might not be a bad insect, could be a good insect. So you just need to make sure you know what you're trying to do before you start spraying. There's also a whole lot of other cultural control methods that are used to control insects besides spraying. So there's crop rotation. You can plant resistant varieties. Some varieties are more resistant to insects than others. Sometimes just tilling will help. In the fall, if you till after your garden's done, you can till the ground and that will bury insect eggs deeper. There's also insect predators that you can sometimes introduce that will help control insects. And you can also use insect exclusion. And all that means is a screening material. There's some row cover fabrics and also some other screening type materials that are useful if you're trying to screen out certain insects. And then there's some really old techniques of hand picking, which sounds, kind of scary to some people because bugs can be very not pleasant sometimes. But there are certain insects which it's fairly easy just to pick them by hand and get rid of them. And then there's also some traps that you can use in your garden that will help attract the insects, and then they'll get caught in the trap, and then you won't have to worry about them because they'll be stuck in your trap, and then you clean out your trap every now and then or get a new trap. So, all right, as far as planting, we're still planting the garden. Crop selection, this sounds kind of simple, but I tell people grow what you like to eat, meaning grow what you like to eat the most. Because if you like very, very many different kinds of vegetables, it's, kind of easy to think, oh, I want to grow everything. And I know this is especially easy if you're a brand new beginning gardener. You're so excited about vegetable gardening, which is good, I'm glad, but you think you want to try and grow every kind of vegetable there is. And that could just be very difficult if you haven't done it a lot before. So I recommend, starting small. You can always go bigger the next year and try more, but I usually say for a beginner, try to pick, at least 2 things, but maybe no more than 5 things the first year. Crops that you think you want to try and grow that you think you're going to use a lot of. For me, I grow a lot of peppers, I grow a lot of tomatoes, a lot of onions, and a lot of sweet potatoes. I grow other things too, but those are things that I grow a lot of because those are things that I know I eat a lot of. And also I recommend starting with easier growing crops. There are some things that are just difficult around here. Carrots can be tricky because they're hard to germinate seeds sometimes, and you have to thin them properly. Sweet corn can be kind of tricky. There's some bugs that attack sweet corn and make it difficult to grow. And also sweet corn needs a fair amount of fertilizer. And so some people just have difficulty with that. Brussels sprouts can be difficult because they're in the ground for so long. It takes a long season, spring, summer, and fall before you get Brussels sprouts. And there's many insects that can bother them. So some things are just harder. Peppers, on the other hand, are pretty easy. There's not a lot of problems. Pretty good crop for beginners. All right, so that's preparation. Now we're planning, or we're still planning, sorry. The last slide was also part of the preparation, picking the crops. So the garden layout, again, trying to make that diagram. If you can measure your garden, maybe get some graph paper, and then you can figure out you know, how far apart to plant things and all that kind of stuff. It's really helpful just to get it down on paper. I will tell you there's lots of tools, planning tools for your gardens on the internet these days. You'll see lots of websites will have a tool for recommending that. Most of them I'm not very impressed with. We actually have a planning tool on our website that you can use, and it's for free. It's also specially designed for using raised beds, but you can also use it with ground plots. And this planning tool was actually developed by one of our staff members at Kansas City Community Gardens, and it really is a very helpful tool to look at. So I recommend taking a look at that. But in any case, even if you don't do that, if you're not an online type of person, at least try to make a diagram and write down where you're going to plant different things, different sections, different rows, and then keep that plan from year to year, because that will help you remember what your garden was like last year and help you make your new plan for next year, and also will help you with your crop rotation. All right, so we're still planning. Variety selections. So maybe you have figured out that you're going to grow lettuce, you're going to grow spinach, you're going to grow beans, you're going to grow tomatoes, you're going to grow peppers. That's fine, but what kinds of varieties are you going to pick? So there's lots of different varieties. You know, if you're going to be a gardener, you're going to start getting seed catalogs in the mail at some point. All you have to do is you can send for those online. They'll send them to you, offer for free, or you can just look at online catalogs. But there are so many different varieties, particularly things like tomatoes and peppers. There are literally companies that specialize just in tomatoes or just in tomatoes and peppers. So here at Kansas City Community Gardens, we grow varieties that we've had good success with here in our area, which is another helpful thing, because sometimes the seed catalog might be sort of oriented more towards the Pacific Northwest, where they have cool summers, or the Northeast, where they have cool summers, or the South, where it's even hotter, or the Rocky Mountains, where they have cool summers. So here in Missouri and Kansas, we have hot summers, and you know, we do have cool falls and cool springs, and sometimes the weather does crazy things. So we try to grow varieties that we think will do pretty well here. So here are a few varieties just that are very popular. If you get our Seeders Digest, which is our little newspaper thing that comes out in actual paper form, but you can also access it on the web, it will list all the varieties of seeds and all the varieties of plants that we have. And we have our regular seeds and we have our specialty seeds. So anyhow, here's just a few of our favorites. If you're trying to grow onions and you've had difficulty in growing bulb onions, I recommend Superstar. If you want to try a really good crisp lettuce, that canasta is really good. That's what that picture is right there. We also have an anniversary blend that's our own special blend of a bunch of different kinds of lettuces that gives you a really nice spring mix if you like those kinds of mixes where you have all different colors and textures of lettuce. You know, if you're just looking for good tomatoes, there's so many. Those are some of the bigger red type tomatoes, but there's also some really great cherry tomatoes that we have, like Sun Gold. We also have some heirloom varieties. For peppers, there's many good varieties, but you know, one variety I like a lot is Gypsy. That's the first slide I showed you tonight. We'll probably see the picture again at some point. It's a Hungarian pepper, has really nice, it's semi bell shaped. It's not a big traditional bell pepper, but it's very sweet. When it turns color, it turns yellow, and then it eventually turns orange, and then turns red. So it's probably my favorite pepper. Red Knight is a big bell pepper that starts out green and turns red when it's ripe, but it's much more productive than most of the large red peppers that you will see in other catalogs. And then sweet potato, we have a really great variety called Beauregard, which produces lots. It keeps a long time, has really good color and really good nutrition. It's a great sweet potato for our area. So those are just some of the varieties, but please check out our website or look at the Seeders Digest and start looking at all those different choices. Again, the seeds, we buy our seeds in bulk, and we have volunteers package them. We figure by buying from different companies, we can pick the best varieties that we like, that we think will do the best for you. but we also are trying to get varieties that we know will do well here. And we often get the question about, are our seeds, have they been, engineered, biologically engineered, chemically engineered, whatever. And so we are not buying any kinds of seeds like that. We talk more about that in some of our other our other workshops, but thing is, you can just be assured that the seeds you're getting here have not been engineered. So, all right. So we're still preparing the garden, the soil preparation, soil testing. Lots of times people worry about soil testing, and I've even seen people just kind of put off, say, gosh, I want to start a garden, but I feel like I need to get the soil tested first. And sometimes it's just because they're afraid that there might be chemicals or some bad nutrients in their soil. So, but generally, just in your average backyard garden site, you shouldn't have too many problems. If you're putting a garden on some kind of a site that's been like an industrial site or some kind of business, or maybe it's been farmed recently with chemical farming, those are all potential issues. But the thing about soil testing, and I also want to recommend, we are going to have a workshop on soils coming up. We haven't really done a workshop on soils, I don't think ever, but we've been getting lots of requests for it. So if you want to know more about soils, I will recommend that workshop to you that's coming up. But just a little bit about soil testing. It doesn't really tell you if you have good soil. It tells you nutrient levels, particularly like potassium and phosphorus. That's the P and the K symbols there. It will also tell you the pH, which is very useful. And our soils around here tend to be kind of high pH, which means they're a little on the alkaline side. So sometimes we need to make adjustments for that by adding sulfur. The soil test also will tell you the percentage of organic matter, and that's probably one of the most useful things it tells you, because the higher the percentage of organic matter, the better your soil is. So that does give you a little indicator if it's a good soil. Generally, what we're looking for is a soil that's at least 5% organic matter, and higher is better. But 5 would be kind of the minimum for a good garden. The soil test will also typically not tell you the nitrogen level, because that changes so much, even from day to day. If you get heavy rain, it washes excess nitrogen through the soil. So what you're trying to do when you get that soil test is look to see if you have too much phosphorus or potassium, or if the pH is real high, you might need to make adjustments. The average soil test does not test for toxic materials like lead or heavy metals. And almost no soil test will test for like dangerous chemicals like herbicide, excess herbicide in the soil, things like that, or other toxic chemicals. That would be kind of an unusual situation that you would have to use a special laboratory for that, and that can be very expensive. But you can get a lead test if you want to get your soil tested for lead. But typically the Missouri and Kansas Extension soil testing does not test for lead. So there are special places that you can send away to get lead tests. So that's something we can help you find out. We'll talk more about that when we do our soil workshop. So, but preparing the soil for gardening, especially if it's low in organic matter or just ongoing, gardeners are always working to try and make their soil better and better, because if you work to improve your soil, you will have a better garden. So I tell people really what it comes down to is adding organic matter. There's lots of different soil amendments you can add. People want to sell you all kinds of stuff. There's so many different products out there. But really, it's just about adding organic matter, increasing that percentage of organic matter. Because if you do that, it does all these amazing things for you that you see listed here. It will increase the water holding capacity if you have more organic matter, because it acts like a sponge, sort of holds more water, but also increases the pore space. And what that refers to is the little tiny particles. We'll talk about this more in the soil workshop. The little tiny soil particles, in between those particles, there's air, and it's good to have good sized spaces for the air, so that your soil can get oxygen, and that's important, and also so that it can hold excess water or sufficient water. But organic matter also helps the soil to hold more nutrients. In a really sandy soil, the nutrients just wash out real quickly because there's nothing to hold it in. It just literally washes out when you get big rains. But with the organic matter that holds the nutrients into the soil so it doesn't wash through so quickly. It also increases the soil microbial activity, which means all the little soil microbes, all the little organisms that are so important to making soil efficient for plant growth. That all happens to a greater extent in the presence of higher organic matter. If you just have clay, which is no organic matter, you have very little microbial activity, and so your soils are not going to be in good shape. The other thing is just having lots of organic matter will improve the texture and the tillage, meaning that it will make it easier for you when you're digging, when you're hoeing, when you're pulling weeds out, when you're trying to get it ready for planting, if you're tilling it. The more organic matter you have, the better it will be, and all those things will be much easier. So when you're adding soil amendments, we tell people fall is best. But if you're doing your garden right now, you can still add organic matter. You just have to be careful what you add. Costs will vary a lot. If you're buying something in bags, it's going to be expensive. You can use inexpensive sources of organic matter. So things like leaves, when your leaves fall down, you can save them, add them to your garden in the fall. Grass clippings, if you don't get your grass sprayed with chemical pesticides, you can use the lawn clippings that you collect. You can also buy compost. I mean, you can make your own compost too, but it would be hard to make enough of your own compost to make a big difference. So if you're going to buy something and you're going to buy something in bulk, I would recommend buying compost from a reputable compost company. And it will generally be a mixture of leaves and wood trimmings, wood clips, wood chips, grass clippings, all those things get ground up and make compost. And so, but you want to make sure you buy from a reputable company that's, not adding bad things into your compost. So anyhow, you can buy that in bulk. Like you can drive and take your pickup truck and get like a pickup load at a time, or you can get a large truck delivered. It can be expensive, but overall, it's a lot cheaper to buy like a pickup load of something in bulk than to buy a bunch of bags. Some people also are interested in growing cover crops. That's where you plant a special crop to add organic matter. Farmers do this a lot because they can't afford to buy stuff in bags for their whole farm, or they can't afford to get lots and lots of truckloads of compost already made. So they will plant a crop just for the purpose of then tilling it under and adding organic matter. The thing is that can be tricky because it takes time. You have to have good equipment that will till that area, till that crop into the soil, and you need to do it in advance so it's time to break down. So if you have a really big garden space, the cover crop thing can be helpful, but there's also some things that makes it difficult. So we'll talk more about that when we do our soils class. I also tell people to avoid manure and sawdust, especially in the spring. Manure is fine in the fall because it has time to age and decompose, but fresh manure can be very, very strong and potent. And I don't mean just the smell, I mean in the nutrient levels. It can be very strong and you can actually burn your crops with fresh manure. So, and sawdust can actually just rob the nitrogen out of the soil. So there's problems with that also. All right, we are still preparing that garden. So tilling. People ask about no-till gardening and tilling. There's a lot of interest in no-till gardening, and it definitely can be very helpful. The thing is, if you are going to do it, we recommend that you're going to build raised beds, either with sides or without sides. And I recommend that you do that and, at least till once to get the ground loosened for that. And then after that, you can avoid tilling if you want to. The thing is, with no-till, you have to be very careful to control weeds because it's really easy to let weeds get away from you. And once it's, out of control, sometimes the only answer is maybe to till if you can't pull them all. I do recommend if you are going to get your garden till at the proper soil moisture, meaning you don't want to till it when it's too wet. Because if it's too wet, it'll just turn into large mud balls, especially if there's very much clay in there. And it can make it really, really difficult to plant. In fact, it can mess your soil up for a whole season or longer if you till when it's wet. So you'll know when it's about right because you can go out, you can grab a handful of soil and squeeze it, and it'll feel moist, but when you squeeze it and then crumble it, it should just crumble in your hand. It shouldn't stay stuck together like a mud ball. So what I advise people to do is if you had your garden mulched the year before, pull back all the mulch, like it's straw, just rake it back, because otherwise your garden is going to stay moist and won't dry out to where you can get it tilled. If you're planting stuff for the late summer for a fall garden and it's super dry, you may actually need to water your garden to get some moisture in there to make it easier to till. But that's a little unusual. That's usually just in the summer. I recommend to try and till at least 6 to 8 inches deep and don't over-till. And that would mean once it gets broken down, you don't need to go over it and over it to try and get it perfectly as fine as dust. In fact, that's better not to do it as fine as dust. The first year of tilling is definitely the hardest because you'll have sod. You can see in this picture here, all the sod. It's really difficult. If you have ever tried to go rent a tiller somewhere and you're trying to till up sod, it is really hard. So I would almost recommend that you hire your tilling done the first year. Maybe find someone with a small tractor like this that's more efficient at tearing up that sod, and then you'll have to rake out the clumps of dirt. But then after that, it shouldn't be a problem to just use a regular tiller. Also, you can spade up, or till or plow in the fall, and that will get your garden ready for spring and make it easier to get ready. The other thing is if you're planting your garden for a year out, meaning like in the fall or the summer before, and you know you're going to add some new garden space, what you can do is smother out that grass by putting in a thick layer of mulch or putting down cardboard and just smothering that grass, the summer before, and it'll kill the grass, and then leave it on all through the fall. And then the next spring, you can pull that cardboard off or pull the mulch back. And usually the sod will just be dead. And then it's really easy to do, get your garden tilled up. So you do want to avoid compacting the soil after you tilled it, meaning try not to walk on it too much, or at least mark where your paths are or your beds are going to be and try not to walk on that. All right, so now that's all the preparation. So now we're talking about actually planting the garden, which is the fun part. It's definitely fun. I know a lot of people are excited about planting their garden. It's been really nice weather lately. So we do recommend planting at the proper time. So I recommend using a planting calendar. Right here, you'll see a picture of this. We'll look at this a little closer up here in a minute. Because it's important to know when the proper time is. So some vegetables like to be planted when it's cool. They grow best when it's cool. Other ones like to be planted when it's a little bit warmer. They grow best in the warm season. So follow this planting calendar. It will have good dates on it. I do recommend following this rather than planting by the moon or the almanac, or even if you just get a generic seed packet like from Home Depot or wherever, it really can't tell you specific planting dates. For here in Missouri, it'll tell you some things like plant before or after the last frost, 2 weeks after the last frost or something like that. But who knows when that will be, and it changes every year. I'm definitely not a big fan of the almanac or planting by the moon. It just doesn't seem like it really can produce good results as opposed to using the planting calendar. I know some people who do swear by planting by the moon and they have really good results, but that's generally because they're just really good gardeners. So anyhow, all right, let's look at the planting calendar a little bit closer. This is available online. You can find it in our resources section on our website. These planting dates have been actually drawn from a document that the Missouri Extension Service developed. They have a planting calendar also. We tweaked it a little bit. But you'll see all the main vegetables here, and they're listed alphabetically. And sometimes you'll see something in parentheses and it will say plants. Like here, we're talking about cabbage and it says plants. And that's because generally you're not going to be planting cabbages from seed because they wouldn't have time. So you're going to buy cabbage plants and start them and plant them as a plant rather than dropping seeds out. Same thing would be true like with tomatoes. You're going to put tomato plants out generally as opposed to planting seeds. Not to say that you can't try growing your own plants. Maybe you can do that indoor under lights or get a small greenhouse someday. But that's another whole proposition. But if you don't see that word plants in parentheses after it, like when you see beets or beans or Swiss chard, that means you're just going to be planting those seeds directly in the ground. And so you'll see dates there. So like for corn, for instance, you look here for corn, you can plant corn starting about April 25th and plant, anytime between that and July 1st. After that, most corn wouldn't have time to mature. If you plant before that, the ground will be too cold. So that's kind of the planting window in there. On some of these crops, you'll see two different planting dates. Like for instance, let's look at one, excuse me, like for broccoli plants. You'll see right here, there is a date that says March 20th to April 10th. So that would be for spring. So coming up here soon, that's a good time to put out plants. That's kind of a narrow window. So if you plant after that, it's going to get too hot. Your broccoli won't do well. If you plant before that time, it might be too cold. It could be actually cold enough to kill the broccoli plants or cause other problems. But you'll notice there's a second planting date under there for broccoli after the March 20th date. And the second date is for planting for fall gardens. So you'll see there, it says July 25th through August 5th. That would be the time when you plant in late summer for fall. We will do a whole separate workshop on fall gardening later. That comes up in July, I believe. And we'll talk about, kind of the tricks for planting a garden for fall. The important thing just to know is that you don't wait till fall to plant. You're planting in late summer for fall. So this planting calendar is really useful. I do recommend you print one out because it's just handy to have when you're out in the garden. And you can look at it and make sure you're planting at the right dates. The other document that's kind of helpful is this cool season, warm season document. It's available on our website. It basically just breaks down. It's not as specific as the planting calendar, but it just has like a list of all the cool season ones on this side and a list of all the warm season ones on this side. And that's kind of good just because it kind of helps you get a sense of which ones are which. And to think of, okay, so these are all the things I'm going to be planting earlier over on the left side, and the ones on the right, I'm going to be planting these later. It's also just really handy to look at, like, let's say you are looking at, you had something from spring early and it's all done, your spinach is all done. And that way you can look at the warm season list and say, okay, what can I still plant here? And then look at the planting calendar. Now, these are just general planting times. For the first part is the cool season. It's about March 15th to April 15th. And not every cool season crop can you plant as early as March 15th. And not everyone can you plant as late as April 15th. But this gives you a general idea of what that cool season planting window looks like. And then the warm season planting window is about May 1st to June 10th. That doesn't mean you can't sometimes plant earlier. I often plant a little earlier than that May 1st date, especially if it looks like we're having a nice early spring and it's warming up nicely. So sometimes you can get a jump on getting your tomato plants in the ground a little bit earlier than that. But these are considered the kind of basic planting windows. And then that second cool season, planting for fall, usually about July 20th to August 10th. There's some things you can plant a little bit later. And anyhow, that's planting in late summer for your fall harvest. So you're also going to be watching the weather when you're getting ready to plant because we know the weather can change drastically. Right now, we've been enjoying this wonderful spell of warm weather, but it could change. I think it's supposed to next week possibly freeze again, and we're supposed to get some snow, possibly. So I tell people, make it a habit, watch the weather. use the websites that are out there. Weather.com is a pretty good one. Also, Weather Underground is very good. I like to look at least 2 different ones because sometimes, they're saying different things. And also, you can look at the local weather forecast. Sometimes they'll have a little more information. I would say the one that I probably count the most on is Weather Underground. You can find that in your app store. It's just really, really helpful. It'll tell you lots of times what time of day it's expected to rain, which is very helpful. If you're going to try and plant on the weekend and it's supposed to rain on Saturday, it makes a big difference. Is it going to rain Saturday morning or is it going to rain Saturday night? If you can make a guess, because nobody's for sure, it will tell you maybe it's going to rain at night so you can do your planting in the morning. So it's also useful to get that 10-day forecast because that way you can look ahead to see like the weekend when you maybe want to do your planting or you're going to harvest something. It will let you know what the weather's looking like. It's going to get cold, it's going to have lots of rain. All very useful information to have. Particularly, you're looking at to see what are the high temperatures going to be and the low temperatures. And of course, when we're talking about freezing, it's the low temperatures, obviously at night. The precipitation, the weather is also going to make a big difference, because if it's muddy, you can't really plant, you can't work the ground, you can't till up. If it's super muddy, even weeding gets hard. Although after a rain, a couple of days after a rain, or even one day after rain, sometimes that'll make weeding easier. So it's worth putting off the weeding for a little while. The other thing is just that freezing or that high heat can really affect your planting, especially if you're setting out little plants. And if it's going to be super windy and full sun, setting out new transplants sometimes can be difficult just because of the weather stress. All right, planting the garden, just the actual planting technique. A lot of beginning gardeners are just kind of nervous about planting seeds, especially about planting tiny seeds. It's really not too difficult as long as you are following instructions, planting them at the proper depth. What happens often is people plant too deep and the little seeds have a hard time poking up through the thick layer of soil. So, planting the proper depths, keeping those seeds moist, watering them, lightly. Sometimes it's helpful to plant certain things in hills, sometimes in rows, sometimes you're just broadcasting. We're going to try and do a workshop sometime soon, showing actual planting techniques. And I know there's going to be some hands-on workshops that might be available.
We'll be able to sleep in your room anymore.
So anyhow, when you're setting out plants, you want to make sure you plant them at the proper depth, meaning the top of that root ball should be kind of even with the ground. We also have some great videos. If you look on our website, there's a bunch of great videos that our Schoolyard Gardens group has done that show proper planting techniques. If you can physically see them planting, see what it looks like. Also, when you take your little plant out of the little pot, the little 3-pack or 4-pack, whatever it comes in, lots of times those roots are all bound up and you need to loosen them. Sometimes actually take a scissors and cut and trim and pull them out, pull them apart a little bit so the roots will grow out into that surrounding soil. And then also I like to put a circle of mulch around each plant. It might be early to mulch the whole bed, but if you put a little bit of circle of mulch around the plant, that will help it so it won't dry out so quickly. And of course, always when you plant plants, you want to water. Because otherwise the plants could dry out very quickly. Planting seeds also is helpful to put water out, to sprinkle the seeds, because that'll start the germination process right away. As far as spacing, it's so easy to plant your seeds too closely together. So look at your seed packets. We also have some guide sheets available, especially for the raised bed gardening, or use the garden planning tool. It will tell you the proper spacing for planting the seeds, planting the plants. How far apart do you put your rows? If you're doing a ground plot, you need to leave enough room for your paths in between. There'll be different spacing for seeds, different spacing for plants. And in raised beds, we often use equidistant spacing. And what that means is rather than having a big, path in between, because you're not walking on that raised beds, you're going to be putting it equidistant. So like, look at these seed potatoes they're setting out here. It's going to be like 12 inches from here to here and 12 inches from here to here. That means equidistant spacing. So there's not going to be a big wide row in between because that would be a waste of space. You can also use predetermined spacing, meaning like if it's telling you to put your corn plants, a foot apart, rather than just sprinkling out a whole bunch of corn seeds in a row, put like 2 seeds every foot. And then if they both come up, you'll pull out the extra ones, but that way they'll all be, each one of your little corn stalks will be 1 foot apart easily. You can also do that with okra, green beans, use that predetermined spacing. And then also, if you do plant lots of seeds, like you're planting lettuce and you have a whole bunch of lettuce seeds out there and they all come up, you're going to need to thin them out, or carrots. So there's guidelines to like how far apart your final plant should be. So you're going to be getting rid of little seedlings. We'll talk about thinning here in a little bit. So planting, it's a good idea. Rotate your crops. So if you had tomatoes in one certain area last year, try and put your tomatoes in a different place this year. And then next year, put them in still a different place. And so why do we rotate crops? That's because it will help to suppress insects and diseases, because there's lots of diseases that accumulate with certain crops like tomatoes or squash. And there's lots of insects that accumulate with certain crops like squash. Squash and cucumbers have all kinds of bug problems. Other things, they have certain insect pests. And so if you move your crops around, that will help it so those insect populations don't build up. And so keeping good records is really important. That will help you, but also it's just your crops will do better if you rotate them annually. I did forget to mention, so you're trying to rotate them by your families, like the tomato family, the cole crop, which is like the broccoli and cabbage family, the cucurbic family is like squash and cucumber and melons. We also do have a handout sheet, guide sheet on the website that shows you all the different families, so you can know which ones to rotate, which groups and put them where. All right, cropping plans. This just refers to, are you going to have cool season crop or warm season crop? So a single cropping plan means that's typically what you would do with a warm season, because you might just, wait till it's warm enough and plant your tomatoes, or wait till it's warm enough and plant your sweet potatoes. But if you have limited space, especially in a raised bed, sometimes you might do some double cropping. And what that might mean is you'll plant a cool season in the spring and then just let it go until it's done. And then it'll sit fallow for a while. And then you'll plant again in late summer for another cool season. And of course, you'd want to do a different crop, not plant the same thing, but plant that in the fall. And that would be double cropping. You're getting 2 cool season crops in the year. You can also get 2 crops, double crop, by sometimes using a cool season and a warm season. And one way that you might do that would be like in this bed right here, there's lots of lettuce and spinach planted. And you'll notice that you got all these great heads of lettuce. And so the problem is, who wants to eat, 10 big heads of lettuce in 1 week? It's not going to be very easy, even if you have friends and neighbors to share with. So what you might do is pick some of your lettuce earlier, rather than letting them all get big. Pick some at a little smaller stage. And then once you pull that out, you'll have an empty spot. And that's where you could stick your tomato plant in, or plant some zucchini squash seeds. And so then, the next week you might pull out some more lettuce and there'll be more room. So then as those tomatoes grow, as the squash grow, you'll pull out more lettuce, and pretty soon it'll be too hot for lettuce anyhow. That would be another way to double crop, where you have a warm season crop. And you start out with the cool season crop and then go to a warm season crop. Okay, so we've talked about preparing, planning, planting. Now we're talking about garden maintenance. So this means taking care of your garden. Obviously, planting is the first part of it, but as far as taking care of that stuff once it's planted, there's lots of different things to do that. And so one of the, of course, will be weeding. We're going to talk about all these, but it's weeding, mulching, watering, fertilizing, thinning, training, and controlling insects and diseases. And this doesn't mean like there's necessarily a perfect order to this, because you're going to be doing all of these. And sometimes you'll be doing them simultaneously. So weeding. There are so many gardeners that have difficulty with weeds, and that's because there's lots of weed seeds out there. So weeds break down into different categories, annual weeds and perennial weeds. And so annual weeds, meaning that they grow, they bloom, they set seeds, and they die all in one year. And so some examples of examples of annual weeds would be like lamb's quarters, pigweed, ragweed. There's a bunch of them. This is actually some lamb's quarters here. And of course, the definition of a weed is a plant that's growing somewhere where you don't want it to grow. So some people will always say, well, lamb's quarters, that's a really good green, you can eat them. And that is true. But if they're growing and they're getting big and they're crowding out your lettuce, then they're a weed. So anyhow, the problem is with annual weeds, they can grow up big, and they can produce, literally each plant can produce thousands of seeds. And if you let them go to seed, they can take over your garden in a short time and leave lots of weed seeds for next year. So even if you don't get them all pulled, at least, cut them off, mow them down so they don't produce seeds. Perennial weeds, on the other hand, they grow from year to year, just like perennial flowers come up again next year and the year after that. Perennial weeds come up next year and the year after that and the year after that. So the roots can survive for many years. They die down over the winter. They produce new growth in the spring, but they also drop seeds. Like you'll see this plant right here, this bindweed, looks like a pretty little morning glory, which is in the morning glory family. But this plant will, shade out and, smother your little plants that you're trying to grow. And so at the very least, you should at least pull it and break it off. People say, I pull it and it just breaks off, but that's better than nothing, because that means you removed all the leaves. It needs leaves to continue to grow. So it'll sprout back up, and then you pull it and break it off again. And you keep doing that until the plant is exhausted and doesn't have any nutrients left in it. So there's some examples of some perennial weeds like dandelions, different perennial grasses, bindweed, Bermuda grass. Those are all terrible perennial weeds. But weed control is a major factor for garden success. There's so many gardeners that get discouraged. Your plot gets taken over with weeds. So the idea is to stop the weeds before they start growing. And of course, lots of people will instantly start thinking of things like, I could use weed killer on my garden because it will kill the weeds. The problem is most weed killers, which are also called herbicides, also kill every kind of plant. So if you spray a weed killer in your garden, not only will it kill your weeds, but it's going to kill all your crops. There are some weed killers called pre-emergents, which means they stop seeds from growing. And that's typically a chemical that stops that little seed from germinating. And farmers will use this, and it will stop a lot of those annual seeds from sprouting. The problem is, if you put a pre-emergent herbicide down, like a granular thing, there's a variety called Preen. You'll see it in the store. It does stop weed seeds from growing, but will also stop your garden seeds from growing. So it doesn't matter what kind of seeds they are, it will stop those garden seeds from growing. So you would never want to use that if you're going to plant seeds in your garden. So, and if you put down too much, sometimes it will carry over to the next year. So I am not a big fan of herbicides in general. There's better ways to control weeds. There are some organic herbicides available now. That doesn't mean they can't still be dangerous. One of those is commercial grade vinegar, which means like 20%, 25% acidity. Just regular grocery store vinegar is not strong enough to kill weeds. It'll mess the leaves up, but it generally won't kill them. But you can buy commercial grade vinegar, and that will kill annual weeds. But again, if you spray it on your crops that you want, it will actually kill them also. but at least it won't leave toxic residues in your soil. There's also a pre-emergent herbicide that's organic, and it's called corn gluten, and there's different brand names for it. They found if you use corn gluten on your soil, it will stop weed seeds from sprouting. So some people will use that as a pre-emergent herbicide, but will also stop your other seeds, like if you're trying to plant lettuce or turnips or mustard or spinach or whatever, it will stop those seeds from sprouting too. So again, you have to be careful with that. But if you are going to try using herbicides, I would definitely recommend using the organic ones like the vinegar or the corn gluten products. So you can also do weed prevention with landscape fabric. You know, people do this lots of times around their trees and shrubs, put down some black material that's like a net type fabric. They used to sometimes just use black plastic. The problem with regular black plastic sheeting is it doesn't let the water through. And of course, it heats up very much. But you can get that black landscape fabric. It will let water through and will smother out weeds. And this can be useful like around your tomato plants. You know, sometimes people will put out a row of landscape fabric and then cut a hole in the fabric and then plant their tomato plant, and it will control weeds. Can also heat up. So the weed prevention I like to use is mulch. If you put down mulch, which is some kind of organic matter, it will smother out weeds. In my very first garden, I started, and that was a long time ago, my very first garden, I started using mulch. I was using grass clippings. We didn't use chemicals on our lawn. I had to catch the grass clippings and put down grass clippings, and it smothered out the weeds. And I had very few weeds. And so it really made my whole gardening experience so much better. So we'll talk about mulch here in a minute. Cultivation refers to using like tiller or a hoe to control weeds. So hand weeding, you know, you can use shallow cultivation prior to mulching, which just means take a hoe and you're just kind of working up the ground. I really recommend, let me check my slide here. Yeah, I really recommend, you know, if you're going to plant and your ground is bare, you go out after a rain and take a hoe and just break up the top inch or two, even if you're just seeing little tiny weeds, and that will help those little tiny weeds not to grow into big weeds. And that's called cultivation. You can use a rototiller if you want to, but don't go deeply. And you just are literally breaking up those little seedlings that are starting to sprout in that soil. You're breaking up the crust of the soil. And then once you do that, you can put mulch down after that, or you can continue to, you know, use the hoe every couple of weeks. But a hoe is not really for chopping out big weeds. It's for crumbling up the ground and getting the little tiny seedlings just as they're starting to sprout. But if you're going to put down mulch, put it down in between the rows around the plants and smother out the weeds. And you can start out shallow, thick, not very thick layer at first, and then add more later. And basically, you're trying to get rid of weeds and stop them from growing before they go to seed. So mulching is such an important thing to do. I recommend mulching to everyone who gardens. It makes a huge difference. Besides the weed control, which is a big deal, it will conserve soil moisture, meaning your ground won't dry out so quickly. So it's very important to do that. You'll do less watering, but also your plants will just not suffer in the heat so much. It also cools the soil because you're shading it and keeping it moist. Where in the summer, you know, the top inch layer of soil can get like 100 degrees or more, which is really difficult for plant roots, but it's also difficult for soil organisms trying to grow in that. So if you put mulch down, it will keep it cooler. It will add organic matter at the end of the season. You can till that mulch in. But again, it also will suppress the weeds, will also prevent the rain from packing down your soil and crusting it. So many good benefits. I recommend mulching to every single gardener in the whole wide world. All right, so what to use for mulch? Straw is good. You'll get some, if you don't know what straw is, it's different than hay. Straw is what comes from after they harvest the wheat. It's the stalks from wheat, or it could be also there's other kinds of straw like barley or oat straw, but generally we're looking at wheat straw around here. So you'll get a few of the seeds from the wheat sometimes will sprout up in the straw, but it's usually pretty easy to take care of. Hay, on the other hand, is what comes when farmers cut a pasture area and they're trying to cut the leaves of something like grass or grass and clover together, alfalfa maybe, and then they'll dry that and use that for feeding animals. The problem is lots of times in that hay, there's going to be a whole bunch of weed seeds. We generally recommend not using hay, but rather to use straw. So straw is good. Again, lawn clippings, grass clippings from your lawn work well. I like them a lot, especially when they're green. They're easy to put down, easy to fit into little tiny spaces in between small plants. But you want to use grass clippings from lawns that have not been sprayed. They say you can use it from lawns that have been sprayed if you wait a week afterwards. But I'm still just not a fan of that. So if you're going to buy something in a bag to use as a mulch, don't buy like bark chips. Don't buy wood chips. Even shredded bark, not so good. The best thing to buy in a bag is called cotton burr compost. You can buy it here at the community gardens. You can also buy it at garden centers like Home Depot, Lowe's, nurseries. Try to get something that's 100% cotton burr compost, not has wood chips added to it. Sometimes they'll call it cotton boll
Okay, I'm kind
compost.
of done with this. It's,
So those are, if you're going to buy something in a bag, that's what I recommend. Or you could try the weed fabric as a mulch too. Sometimes people will put weed fabric down and they'll put grass clippings or straw on top of it. So you can do that too. But absolutely, I recommend do not use wood chips for mulching in your vegetable garden. Sometimes you might use it around your fruit trees or your berry plants. That's a little bit different because at the end of the season, you're typically going to take your mulch and till it in. And if you do that, you know, you're going to be tilling in wood chips, and that can cause problems. It can also cause splinters when you're trying to work the soil with your hands, if you're planting in there. But also, if your garden's anywhere near a wooden structure like a shed or your house, you're going to be inviting termites to come into your garden, which is not a good thing. So wood chips, it's tempting because you can get them free. They also just don't work very good as a mulch. Weeds tend to grow up in between them so easily, and they also will, as they break down, the wood chips will steal nitrogen out of the soil and can make your crops starve for fertilizer. So as far as when to mulch, I recommend waiting till the soil warms up. If you do it too soon, the soil stays too cool. But before weeds start to get established. So, usually in late spring, early summer, May and June, definitely time to get that mulch on the ground. And how thick? I like to recommend starting out with like maybe 2 inches or at least 1.5 inches, and then you can add some more later, and it will kind of shrink down after a while, especially if you're using grass clippings. And you can use leaves too. Some people like to use leaves, and that's fine. The thing is with leaves is they can, if they're real dry, they can blow away. So if you can use shredded leaves, that's great. Run them through a shredder or a lawnmower to shred them. Leaves will work as great mulch too. All right, so we're still thinking about maintenance here. We should wrap this up because we're kind of near the end. So watering, obviously watering is very important. The thing to remember about watering is if you have young crops and young seeds, little transplants, you're going to water more often, but not water as deep. You're going to be water shallow. You'll often hear advice telling you to water deeply, and that's true, but that's when your garden is more established. When the crops have roots that go down deep, it's important to water deep. So older crops, things that have been in for a while, you'll water less often and you'll water deeper. And so generally the recommendation for an established garden is at least 1 inch of water to 1.5 inches per week. So if we get rain and you get 1 inch of rain, great. The thing is, you can't be sure that you got an inch of rain unless you have a rain gauge out. So I recommend getting a rain gauge, and you can watch. And then once, you know, if it fills up after rain, then you empty it so you'll know how much you're starting from scratch again. Because lots of times you'll think you got a lot of rain and you really only got maybe a quarter of an inch, which is not enough. So then you're going to have to do some irrigating to make up for that rain, because you want to get that inch to inch and a half. At the beginning of the season, you know, you can just water as needed, and it's not so critical. When you're watering seeds and seedlings, I like to use a water breaker on the end of the hose. That's a special nozzle. It's not that thing that looks like a gun that sprays really hard. I'm going to try and get a picture of water breaker on it, but it's a nice nozzle that has a whole bunch of holes in it and puts out a nice gentle spray. There's a really good kind. There's a company, I often don't recommend companies, but this I will, a company called Dram, and they make really good water breakers. And there's one called the Dram 1000 that is, I think, the best water nozzle that you can use in your garden. Anyhow, so you want to use a water breaker because that breaks up the force of the water, so you're not knocking your seedlings over, your little tiny baby plants. And then once you plant the plants, plant the seeds, and plants start to grow, put mulch around, and that will reduce the evaporation so that the water will not all evaporate so quickly. If you don't mulch, it will make you think you need to water every day, because in the heat of summer, the ground will dry out sometimes the same day or the next day right after you water. You think, oh, I need to water again. And typically what that means is you're not watering deep enough, because if you water deep enough, the ground won't dry out so quickly. So in the spring, when crops aren't very big, you might just water a spot here and there whenever it needs it. Some plants will need water before others. But then, and you can do that with a hose, hand watering, or you can put a sprinkler out. I usually like to use a sprinkler more for when I'm trying to water the whole garden. Some people like to use water soaker hoses. You can have those. They put out a nice gentle spray. But usually think about a sprinkler when your whole garden needs watering all at once because it's so hot and so dry. Whereas in the spring, you can just use a hose with the nozzle and just get the spots that are dry whenever they need it. All right, fertilizing your garden. There's many ways to fertilize. Some people just add compost to their garden, but that often does not add enough nutrients, even though it really makes the soil texture really good and makes the nutrients available. Typically, you need to add some kind of fertilizer. So you can use organic fertilizers, you can use chemical fertilizers. Your soil test will tell you how much fertilizer you need to add, and that's a useful thing. And there are signs that plants need fertilizer if they aren't growing very fast. They just seem kind of stunted and sometimes yellowing leaves. That's a sign that you definitely need some nitrogen fertilizer. Some fertilizers, release fast, some slow. And again, organic versus non-organic. There's liquid fertilizers, there's dry fertilizers. There's just so many different ways you can do it. So we will be talking a lot more about fertilizers when we do our soils class. So I do recommend that you look at that when it comes out. But again, regardless of the kind of fertilizer you use, do not exceed the directions. So here's an organic fertilizer that you can buy called Age Old Grow. It's a liquid. You mix it with a certain amount of water. It tells you to do it like once every 2 weeks or something like that. So don't think because of that, it will be better to make it stronger than what it says. And don't think it will be better to do it more often than what it says, because it can be hard on your plants. The other common fertilizer mistake that many gardeners make when they're planting their tomato plants, they'll put like a handful of fertilizer in the hole, and then they'll set the tomato plant on top of that. And that is almost certain instant death for your tomato plant just because it's too much fertilizer right close to those roots. It's better to bury the fertilizer around the plant in a circle and then, put mulch over the top of that. So, all right. So thinning is a maintenance operation we talked about, because when you plant seeds, a whole bunch of seeds will come up and you'll need to thin out the excess ones. So I recommend doing this sooner rather than later, so you don't crowd your little plants so they have enough room to grow. I often see people trying to grow spinach or Swiss chard, and the leaves just don't seem to be getting very big, and that's because they're too crowded. So your planting package, your seed packet will give you guidelines on how far apart to thin to. Your planting plan or the guide sheets will all help you know like how far apart. So like here you see some Swiss chard seeds that are all close together, and they're going to need to be thinned out farther apart, maybe to 2 inches apart at the beginning, and then maybe eventually like 5 or 6 inches apart, maybe even 8 inches apart. Just depends on how big you want your plants to get. The reason it's hard for gardeners to do thinning is because they feel like they're killing stuff. So the thing is, if you don't thin, your plants may die anyhow because they'll be too crowded. They also won't grow very well, and you'll be a frustrated gardener. So it's okay to throw away those seedlings. Sometimes people think, oh, I'm going to try and pull them out and plant them somewhere else. They typically don't move very well. I mean, some varieties of seedlings will, but you have to water right away. And, you know, I think it's easier just to pull them. You can throw them away, or if it's an edible seedling, you know, people go to the store and buy microgreens all the time. That's basically what microgreens are, as little seedlings. So things like lettuce, spinach, turnips, mustard, beets, onions, those are all greens that you could eat. You know, eat the little seedlings. So you can actually use those in your salads. So you can save them and wash them off and eat them. But definitely do your thinning, space them out. Don't wait too late. It's also easier to thin when the ground is moist because the little seedlings will just slip right out. I've seen some books where they recommend trying to clip them using a scissors because they're worried if you're going to pull them out, you're going to disturb the roots. The key to not disturbing the roots is actually to do it when the ground is moist and when the seedlings are still very small. So that will help you so you're not pulling up all the seedlings. All right, another garden maintenance operation is training. That means some things need something to climb on, like because they're a vine, they might need a trellis or a cage. So we recommend using sturdy materials. You know, because a big tomato plant can be kind of heavy. So you want to use a good sturdy tomato cage. You know, if you have a big crop of a vine crop like pole beans or maybe cucumbers, they can have a lot of weight, so you want to have sturdy trellis for that too. So cattle panels, if you're not familiar with those we have some here at the community gardens. You can see what they look like out in the children's garden. It's a metal fence type thing that's rigid. You can use concrete reinforcing wire, especially for tomato cages. Use proper tools to cut. If you're going to cut tomato cages, we recommend using bolt cutters and using zip ties to fasten them, or fasten your trellises together with zip ties. So here are some of the crops that will benefit from training. Things like tomatoes, peas, they climb, you know, on a trellis. Cucumbers will climb on a trellis. Pole beans will climb on a trellis. All these things will benefit from some trellis. And tomatoes you can do on a trellis or you can do in a cage. The thing to remember is get your trellises or cages up before the plants get too big. Because once your peas are up and big, they start to fall down. It's hard to get them to go back up onto the trellis. The same thing is true with the tomato. It's so easy. Almost every gardener does it eventually. They'll put their tomato plants out. They'll start to grow. They wait too long to put the cages on. And then it's hard to kind of get that cage over the tomato without breaking branches. So it's better to do it sooner rather than later. Here you can see some trellises and cages. Here's a tomato cage up here on the upper right-hand corner. You can see the nice big space. This is from concrete reinforcing wire. But it's nice because it allows you to just stick your hands in there, but it also holds the branches as they grow out through those openings. Sometimes people use just stakes on their tomatoes, and that's fine, but you have to keep tying them up so they don't fall over. And also, lots of times, unless your stake really is strong and sturdy, they will fall down, and the whole tomato plant falls down. Here's a trellis with some, looks like beans climbing there. Here's a trellis that has some gourds on it. the cattle panels that I talked about. So it's basically just a fence that's attached to a post, and then they climb right up the side of that. So, all right, so insects and diseases also can be a big, big maintenance item. Generally, insects are more of a problem. They cause more damage than diseases. Not that there aren't diseases, but there are some. When we do our insect class, we'll talk a lot more about insects and all the different kinds and how to control them. Diseases, there's different kinds. There's fungal, there's bacterial, there's viruses, of course, and there's environmental diseases. But more often than, and they are the exception. I would say diseases are more rare. They happen occasionally, depends on the plant. Sometimes certain plants are more prone to diseases like tomatoes. But certain insects you can almost just count on. Like if you plant squash, you are probably going to have squash bugs. If you plant cabbage and broccoli, you're going to have cabbage worms. The little white butterflies will come and lay eggs, and you'll have cabbage worms. So, like squash bugs, squash vine borers on squash and pumpkins, cucumber beetles on squash and cucumbers. If you have eggplants, you're probably going to have flea beetles. If you have corn, you're probably going to have corn earworms. If you have members of the cabbage and broccoli, collards, cauliflower, you're going to have those cabbage loopers, those cabbage worms. So some of these are difficult to control. There are things you can do. So that's why I recommend really checking out the insect class that will be coming up before too long. There's lots of different methods. Rotating crops. Again, we talked about insect exclusion, row covers, screening them out, hand picking, using organic insect controls like BT, spinosad, those are brand names, neem oil. Those are all different kinds of organic controls that can be really helpful for someone who's trying to avoid the use of toxic chemicals. So anyhow, so these are all the things you can do for insects and diseases in addition to spraying. We talked a little bit about these, just a little bit reminder. Just, watch your plants and learn what healthy plants look like, but also be looking for insects. Because once you see insects and you know you have a pest problem, then you can look up and decide what you're going to do about it. But also rotating crops, tilling in the fall, adding organic matter will give you sturdy, healthier plants to help fight off diseases and insects. And just knowing which insects are good, which ones are bad. Getting help, if you need help figuring that out. And then spraying when it's appropriate. And then of course, fall garden cleanup. If you have like tomatoes, if you leave them in, they can spread diseases to your tomatoes for next year. If you leave your squash plants in, you can be leaving, insect eggs that might come out for next year, or even insect adults. So it's good to get rid of them. All right, our final topic, harvesting and storage, picking at the proper stage, when to pick. This could probably also be a whole workshop in itself. You're trying to pick at the stage for best taste, maximum nutrition, ideal stage for storage too. So it's going to be different for different vegetables. Storage conditions are going to be different for different vegetables. Obviously, if you pick a tomato too early, it's going to make a big difference because it's not going to be ripe. If you pick a pepper when it's green, it's not ripe. You can eat it then, but the flavor is better when it's red. Lettuce, on the other hand, is great when it's picked when it's small or at the right stage if it's a head lettuce. But if you let it go too long, it will start to sprout and go to seed, and then it will taste bitter. So you don't want to wait too long. So the different, you'll learn when the right stage for harvesting is as you become a more experienced gardener. It's going to be different for different crops. There's also a difference depending on what you're trying to do. For instance, if you're trying to grow green beans, you're going to eat those beans while they're soft and not ripe. But if you're going to grow pinto beans, you're going to wait till those beans get hard and dry, and then you're going to save those seeds from that for eating and cooking later. Brussels sprouts. They'll actually start forming their sprouts in the late summer, but they don't really get their best. Their best flavor, just like broccoli, will be later on when it's cooler. And for Brussels sprouts, even after frost, the Brussels sprouts will taste better because they'll be sweeter. So different things, lots of timing things to learn. people pick things like zucchini, they wait too long and they get really large zucchinis, which are like as big as a baseball bat and, 2 feet long. And that people get excited because they think they got this giant squash, but the quality isn't as good. So it's better to actually pick zucchinis and summer yellow squash when they're like 6 to 8 inches long, not too big. Sometimes even in the store, they're too big. The other thing is some crops will ripen after you pick them, not very many. The most famous one is tomatoes. If you wait and pick your tomatoes when they're just starting to turn color a little bit red, that's called the color break, when you see that color twinge starting to happen. Then if you pick it, it will finish ripening up and it will have good flavor. If you pick the tomato while it's totally green, it may still turn red on your kitchen counter, but it will not have good flavor. So at least let it try to turn a little bit of red. That can be helpful if you're trying to avoid squirrels by picking them before they turn completely red and finishing the ripening indoors. But some crops do benefit from refrigeration, many crops. Think of leafy things, but also like green peas, lettuce, broccoli, they all go bad quickly at room temperature. But also things like peppers, they love to be stored cool. Broccoli, cabbage, even though they'll keep a while, they do better storing while cool under refrigerator. Some things do not like to be refrigerated, and they do not recommend refrigerating them, except under special conditions, certain circumstances. But things like tomatoes, it always confuses me when people will buy tomatoes at the store, they'll come home and put them in the refrigerator thinking they'll keep longer, and they will keep longer, but the flavor is destroyed when the tomato goes in the refrigerator. Potatoes, sometimes there's problems with them if they stay in the refrigerator too long. I mean, you can store them in the refrigerator, but sometimes they dry out. I don't know, potatoes they also just fill up your whole refrigerator. Eggplant is a warm season crop, does not store well at cool temperatures in the refrigerator. And sweet potato does not do well. It's a tropical vegetable. Do not put sweet potato unless it's been cooked. Same thing with tomato. Once you cook the tomato, it does keep better in the refrigerator, obviously. But cooked sweet potato, yes, you can put it in the refrigerator, you can freeze it, but just raw sweet potatoes, just keep them on the kitchen counter. Sweet potatoes keep better than any other vegetable. It's the only one I know you can keep on your kitchen counter for 9 months and it will be just fine to eat it. So that's just a little bit of storage information about that. So that's our class for today. I do recommend you checking out other classes. We'll go into more detail on different things. We got one coming up just on the early spring crops, the thing that like the cool weather. So that will be helpful to many gardeners. So there you'll see where our address is. If you're not familiar with us, we are a membership organization. You can join and become a member of the community gardens. If you're low-income family, your membership will be very low, only $2. If you're not low income, it will depend on how your income levels, whether you get a yellow card or a blue card. We're located in Swope Park near the zoo and the nature center. There's our phone number. This time of year, sometimes it's hard to get us on the phone. You can also go to our website and you'll find lots of useful information there. And we do invite you to come out and visit us. You can get seeds and plants if you're a member. You can also come visit the children's garden, as that will be opening up in June. So lots of great things to see here at Kansas City Community Gardens. Anyhow, thank you for listening and watching. Look forward to seeing you soon out there, hopefully in the garden. Thank you.
Hey, Ben. Thanks
Yep.
so much. We've got a couple of questions. So for folks who want to stay on, please feel free to do so. But for those of you, thank you for coming. Also, thank you everyone so much for your patience. Hopefully everybody was able to log on. We are totally apologize for sending out the wrong link. So I'm glad that some of you figured out to get in through the passcode, and hopefully you got the link later on. Regardless, all of this will be recorded and on our website in a couple of days, so you'll have it there. A lot of the questions, there were quite a few questions about insects and insect control, Ben, which I think you kind of hit about using BT, squash bug prevention, all of that. So I think To save those, I encourage everyone to come to the What's Bugging You workshop on May 18th, where you'll get all of the details of pest control and the common pests that you'll see in the garden. Ben, a couple of questions that folks had, tried to answer as much as I could in the chat. So if folks have other questions, please put them in the chat. Somebody was asking about starting tomato plants inside. Just kind of the timeline that you recommend for that, and if they've got them in a window. Your recommendation.
The big thing with starting tomatoes inside is you typically don't have enough light. Even if you have a really good window, it's hard to do it. Some people are successful, but you'll have to do it and turn the plants and keep turning them so they get the good light. You're really much better in using indoor lights, like getting some what they call shop lights. They now have them LED or the old fluorescents, like a 4-foot long light fixture, and having 2 or 3 of them together. But as far as timing for that, you want to actually plant your tomato plants not too early. That's the other thing. People plant them too early, they get too big. Because you really only want to get about a 4 to 6 inch tall tomato plant. So really that's going to be somewhere around March 15th. So there's still time to do that. The other thing with lights, growing under lights, is you want to have the plants very, very close, like within an inch, the top leaves of that plant from the light bulbs, in order so they don't stretch out, because that's the other problem people have. They're too far away from the lights and they stretch out and they have really weak seedlings. So we will do a class on that sometime too. Probably, I don't think, it would not make sense to do it this year. We'll probably do that in the late fall, early winter for next year. So people, if they want to build their own light growing chamber or whatever, they can do that and then start their own plants. All right.
Great. The next question, well, first of all, that's great to know too, because we did have somebody asking about some resources for growing in a greenhouse or a covered space. So I'll get back to that person with some specifics. But another question, somebody was asking about adding coffee grounds directly to the soil at the beginning of the season. And they heard that that attracts worms. Can you talk on that?
I mean, it would attract worms in the sense that it's organic matter, and worms do like stuff like that because, you know, they like to burrow into it. I mean, so that's a good thing because worms are good. So, I mean, I have not heard, I've heard a little bit like using coffee grounds, if you use a lot, that there could be some problems with that. I mean, they are a little bit on the acid side. Usually that's not a big problem, but I just would not recommend putting tons and tons of coffee grounds in one place. And it's better not to put that like right around your plants. It's better to spread it out and mix it in. I would generally prefer to put it down before I plant and till it in so it gets spread out.
Great, thank you. I think we were able to answer most of the other questions. Really, there were quite a few questions about insect control. So I'm going to encourage folks to come to that workshop in May, since hopefully they won't be dealing with too many bugs before then.
Yeah. That's why we usually have the workshop a little bit later, because right now there's not a lot of insects, actually big active ones. So it's usually not a problem early in the season.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming, and we hope to see you at future workshops. If you weren't able to sign up for some of the ones, we have opened up more registration. So they're back on our website. So please feel free to sign up for those. Thank you again, and look out for the recording if you didn't get to catch the first part of it.